So why should marijuana be legalized?
Marijuana should be legal because people should get to use what they want to use as long as they're not hurting other people. And same as with alcohol, we treat that as a legal good and we punish people who harm others when they use alcohol, but we don't prohibit the whole market. Doing that creates crime, corruption, it infringes on medicinal uses and civil liberties. So the treatment is much worse than the disease. We're better off having it be legal, taxed, and regulated.
What would you say, though, because I remember there was a member here in the New Mexico legislature who was a former FBI agent, as far as narcotics goes. He says, we already have a big problem with alcohol. If we're going to legalize marijuana, then we're going to compound this problem already. What would you say to that?
I don't think that legalizing marijuana would compound the problem. First of all, it would reduce the problem with marijuana, just as legalizing alcohol reduced the magnitude of the problem for alcohol. Yes, we have problems with alcohol, but prohibiting alcohol was even worse than having legal alcohol. Second, we would probably get some substitution away from alcohol toward marijuana, and all the evidence is that the health effects of marijuana are less bad than those of alcohol, that the driving effects, impairments, are less bad than those of alcohol. So legalizing alcohol will absolutely help on both dimensions, not just on the marijuana dimension.
Well, let's talk about driving. If I'm drunk, take a breathalyzer, they find out what my alcohol intake is. If I'm stoned on marijuana, how does a cop determine whether or not I'm impaired?
It's harder for a cop to determine if you're impaired from marijuana than from alcohol because you can show evidence of marijuana in your system long after you've had any significant impairment. But that's true now. That's a separate problem from whether it should be legal because, of course, we still want to enforce laws against driving under the influence of alcohol or marijuana and other things. But that is a different question than whether the substance should be legal and we should get rid of all the crime, corruption, and basically the mistreatment of people who are using marijuana responsibly without harming others. They are paying the penalty for our current policy.
But if we legalize marijuana, it would follow that more people would smoke it?
It might be that more people would smoke it. If they do so without harming others, that's totally fine. That's exactly what a free society should allow. The evidence suggests that the increase will be very modest. We have seen no evidence that medical marijuana laws or decrim laws have led to significant increases in use. So I think it's a small risk in any case.
Colorado just legalized it.
Right.
Should states like New Mexico say, well, let's see what happens in Colorado. Let's see if this experiment works?
Well, it's certainly interesting to see what the federal government does with respect to Colorado and Washington State, which also legalize, because if the federal government comes in and interferes in a big way, that's going to be a cautionary note for any other state. And that will happen probably in the next few months. So waiting a few months to see how that goes, that's perfectly reasonable. If the feds say okay to those states, then by all means, I would say any other state should get into the same business and help put pressure on the federal government to change the federal law as well.
But should states like New Mexico wait and see what happens in Colorado, and if the experiment works, then adopt it, and if it doesn't, then not?
I would say there's more than enough evidence to go ahead without waiting to see what happens in Colorado or Washington State. We have evidence from other countries, we have evidence from before these things were outlawed, we have evidence from alcohol. Okay, we don't need much more evidence to know that legalization is a much better policy than prohibition.
In many ways, is this a generational thing where younger people are more accepting of it and older people are not?
I think the generation plays a big role. There's so many people now who experienced either consuming themselves or being around people who consumed when they were in college or when they were teenagers. And so they know that a lot of the scare stories are just hopeless exaggeration. And I think that's contributing to a wider tolerance of legalizing.